Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast live stream number 97 Q&A. It is Caturday, although our cat has just left the studio.
No, he left.
He did.
He's off to deputy produce something. Yep. Okay, we're going to try to keep it to an hour today because we have been in front of the screens so much.
We really have.
So much. We might even go less than an hour. Let's just see.
Let's
just see. The Discord question this week. So every week, the people in either of our Patreons get access to our Discord, and people in the Discord pose questions, and then they vote on them, and we answer one question from the Discord every week. This week's question is, why isn't the way that marijuana modulates ACE2 pathways, which seem to play a major role in the inflammation caused by COVID-19, being looked at by science? That question was surprising to me. It hadn't occurred to me, and now, of course, I don't know why I can't find what I'm looking for. The one thing that I found that seems to suggest that some scientists are investigating this was this preprint. Zach, if you would show. Now, this is something that's been a preprint since April 2020. So I don't know what that means about its future, or whether or not the authors still consider this robust. But the title is In Search of Preventative Strategies, Novel Anti-Inflammatory High CBD Cannabis Sativa Extracts Modulate ACE2 Expression in COVID-19 Gateway Tissues. And the idea is that it is thought that sativa in particular, no, not sativa in particular, but CBD in particular, being the molecule that seems to modulate ACE2 expression, may therefore effectively impair the ability of SARS-CoV-2 to use those same pathways to infect people. And then these authors are developing sativa strains that they think may be particularly effective. This is consistent with some stuff that we were talking about early in the pandemic, like April, May, I think, of 2020, right around when this was first shown. It was a preprint, not that we knew that, where this seemingly paradoxical result about former smokers were at some considerable risk, I think, if memory serves, from developing COVID-19, but current smokers actually seem to have something protective. And it turns out that nicotine, nicotine-like cannabis, seems to be involved in the regulation of the ACE2 expression. So, maybe that's consistent with this, but that's sort of all I've got at the moment.
Question is, why is science not investigating it?
Okay.
What I would say is, first of all, I'm not sure that it's the pathway you want to go down. If we had nothing else, okay. But basically, if I understand it correctly, the idea is that CBD alters the rate of expression of the ACE2 receptor genes, which means that it interferes with normal functionality in what they're calling COVID gateway tissues. Now, it could be that in a pandemic, that's worth doing, that the cost of altering those tissues so that they function suboptimally is worthwhile. I mean, costs and benefits in all things. Yeah. But it isn't obvious that you need to do this. So I would just point people to, if you look at the Desert News recently did an extensive discussion on the difference between Indian states in their rates of COVID. And once again, it tells us what we've been telling you here, which is that we have tools that work. So the question is, why are we not using the tools that work? And I don't know what the answer to that question is. I find it shocking that we wouldn't be. It could be incompetence, although at a breathtaking
Desert Review,
level.
You mean? It's going to be the Desert Review.
Yeah.
Imperial Valley.
Yeah. And look.
Is this it?
I can't tell.
Okay.
I don't think so. But in any case, there was an article about the difference between Indian states, those that have embraced early treatment and those that have rejected it. And those that have embraced early treatment and prophylaxis have driven their rates of COVID through the floor.
Yeah, so this is going to be it, I think. Zach, you can show this quickly. This is the Desert Review with an article called India's Ivermectin Blackout, published August 9th, updated September 8th. So talking about the different results in different Indian states.
Anyway, I think the point is, it sort of seems like we have a policy in which we oppose that which works, and that seems bad. It's hard to imagine what else we can say except if we've got that level of breathtaking incompetence, we ought to do away with it. And if it's not incompetence, then we ought to be asking what is driving. But damn.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess the answer to the Discord question is yes. If it was the only hopeful sign, the only hopeful pathway, of course it should be studied, and probably should be studied anyway. But is it the path forward? No, we've got paths forward and we're not using them. So,
yep.
So what gives?
All right. First question from the DarkHorseSubmissions.com site this week. Would the Dark Horse moderator be willing to put me in touch with other dark foals who wish to join forces in saving their friend from the woke? In my case, it's trans. Let's pool our experiences. We can reach them through understanding. Consider this the start of the Save Your Friends initiative. They are too important to lose to the woke. So there's not exactly a question there, except to the Dark Horse moderator about how I'm not sure that our mod has the. I don't know what that should look like. We've definitely talked before about facilitating people finding one another, and it's important. I'm not sure.
One way would be through the Discord.
Yeah, I guess one way would be the Discord, although there's a little bit of not purely functional stuff going on there at the moment, apparently. So yes, in terms of the spirit of this, and it has not been top of our mind, but we have been on again, off again, trying to figure out how to facilitate people getting in touch with one another, because there are lots of you out there who would like to find each other. But yeah, I think the Discord is a good, at least, first pass.
Yep.
Yeah. Next question. I overheard colleagues at work laughing at the death of an elderly Republican who was apparently against COVID. What do you think happens if we get through this to the people who have embraced the cruelty allowed by current vax, anti-vax, lockdown, anti-lockdown, dehumanizing narratives? A lot of ashamed people in denial. What other possibilities?
I would expect intense denial. I think,
reframing of what people's positions actually were.
Yeah, people will
have dropped one ambiguous thing into social media at one point, and they'll point to that and say, "See, I wasn't so sure."
Yeah, no, I think we have a terrible problem here because people have their compassion has been turned off, as we've talked about before. That's a familiar pattern in history. It precedes certain kinds of terrible events, atrocities, and the like. And so having had that triggered and then maybe getting back to a normal mind frame at some point, they will either compartmentalize and not realize what they had become, or they will have terrible existential crises. And I think that the former is much more likely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they will deny it and not see how it is that they are behaving, or an existential crisis. And I think that second option, the existential crisis, is what the person asking the question, the option that they provide, their language for that existential crisis is a lot of ashamed people. And I think this is worth potentially exploring a little bit, that shame has a value, right? Like, shame has been abused for sure by authorities in religions and schools and other systems across time, and used to control behavior where behavior should not have been being controlled. But shame has an adaptive value, and just like grief feels awful, and the response to feeling awful should not be must get rid of feeling, but rather feel the grief that you feel, so that you in the case of grief, depending, so that you remember as much as possible of the person or animal who is gone, and you learn the lessons that need to be learned rather than simply forgetting them so as not to be uncomfortable. So similarly, shame, these emotions that we think of as negative, that doesn't mean that they are to be avoided. We try to avoid them. We should not be trying to avoid the symptoms of the thing. We should be avoiding the thing that is causing them. So if you have reason to feel ashamed, you should actually require of yourself that you exist in that feeling for a while, such that you are less likely to make the error that you made that brought you to the shame in the first place.
Yeah.
And, with all that caveat up front about shame has been often used by various systems to oppress, and that's not an honorable use.
No, there are misfirings of all of these things and abuses, but negative emotions, negative sensations are adaptive, and the idea of them is to steer you towards behavior that fixes an actual problem, not to get you to anesthetize them.
Yeah. That's all.
Yep.
Are there ecosystems dependent on occasional hurricanes? Aside from any effects of the intervening technology, would eliminating or weakening hurricanes be a net positive or negative?
The problem is in your concept of dependent on. I have no doubt that there are many ecosystems that would be radically altered if you eliminated hurricanes. Thinking of low-lying wetlands, barrier islands, all of these things. But so, they could be altered, and it could be that there are species that are so dependent on those ecosystems that their alteration would cause some extinctions. I don't know if that would happen, but it might. But the point is, ecosystems change through time, and the fact that they change doesn't necessarily mean that they've been destroyed. It's sort of a Confucian entering the same river twice kind of question. So what I would say is you can't really address it this way. Do have some habitats evolved in light of periodic hurricanes, and that causes some sort of equilibrium that would be disturbed, probably, but I don't think it'd be. I don't think we can say it would be negative. But you're looking at me with some look like I've made some crazy error.
No, I expected you to go a slightly different direction, so I'm going to prod you to go in that direction.
All right.
I want you to define and then steelman the intermediate disturbance hypothesis.
Yeah, okay. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis, multiply proposed, at least two separate proposals of it.
80s maybe? Something like that. Yeah,
I think so. In any case, it is the hypothesis that diversity is maximized by intermediate levels of disturbance. And the idea being that in very low...
Intermediate in either space or time, I think. Right. And hurricanes having been proposed as one source of diversity enhancing Darwin's hostile force in tropical coastal ecosystems.
Right.
Yeah.
The basic idea, and there's actually such a beautiful experiment that demonstrates that there's at least substantial truth in this hypothesis, which I'll tell you about if I can remember it in a second. But the basic idea is a low diversity, a low level of disturbance causes a low level of diversity because some superior competitor drives out all the others. They go to extinction, and so you get a very small number of competitors. A high level of disturbance basically drives down the number of creatures that can tolerate the environment, right? If it's too chaotic, then things get driven extinct by the hostile forces. In the intermediate levels, we see high diversity, and the beautiful experiment, which I believe was the ecologist, is it Bob Payne? I think it is Bob Payne. Not the ornithologist.
I'm not sure yet.
But in any case, the experiment involved, this is one of my favorites, gluing down rocks in the intertidal zone. So the idea was that rocks in the intertidal zone roll around with waves. Really big rocks don't roll around hardly at all, and little rocks roll around a lot, and medium-sized rocks roll around a bit. And so the basic point was you could see the diversity patterns on the different sizes of rocks, and you could infer that they were the consequence of the level of disturbance, but you could test this by taking rocks that should roll around more and causing them to roll around less by gluing them down, which then caused the diversity to fall, which is super beautiful and experimentally elegant and not high tech, I would point out.
No, not
this
at
is
all.
how really good science works in an environment of mussels and other intertidal creatures.
Absolutely.
You found it?
No, I found a 2007 paper that's sort of a latter day abundance, diversity, and fidelity of macroinverts sheltering beneath rocks during tidal immersion and intertidal cobblefield. Does the intermediate disturbance hypothesis hold for less exposed shores and smaller rocks? But I thought from there I could get here, but there's just a There's so many references that I'm not finding it. Cobble size. I see a Connell. It wasn't Connell. It might have been
Connell was one of the original intermediate disturbance hypothesis,
but not this.
but
not the empirical
experiment.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
If I'm
sure it's
correctly.
in here, but there's just a lot. There's Rough Garden did some stuff too. I remember now.
That would have been
Test-
John Roughgarden.
Yeah.
Joan
98
Roughgarden.
actually.
Oh, well.
That's Joan, I think, at that point. Test of the prediction of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis has Connell listed here for 1978.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've
Sousa?
forgotten who did the
Yeah,
experiment.
I'm not. Anyway.
But anyway, so the reason Heather was smiling at me that way is that I have a love-hate relationship with this hypothesis. I know it to be true and important, but it has been invoked to explain the latitudinal diversity gradient. And it had,
Which is?
The latitudinal diversity gradient is the tendency of species numbers and species density to go up as you get closer to the equator, which is something I studied because from the moment that a world-class ecologist told me that we didn't know why that pattern existed, I thought, wait a second, something is wrong because this pattern exists everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
How could we possibly not know the answer to that question?
Yeah, why is that question not being investigated?
So anyway, I did a dissertation chapter on it and found that the claim of intermediate disturbance that was supposedly supporting the tropical forest habitats being so high diversity, they were using tree falls as their disturbance, they're part of their disturbance regime, which are, yes, disturbing, but also a consequence of high diversity. And therefore,
especially when you're under them, as you have on one occasion been.
Yes, the trees have been out to get me for some time. But but anyway, there's a circular argument in there. And when you eliminate the tree falls, it's a relatively low disturbance habitat that still has high diversity.
If memory serves, I mean, you went through sort of all of the promising leading hypotheses for the latitudinal diversity gradient. And wasn't another problem with intermediate disturbance hypothesis that even if it were true in those tropical forests, which, the circularity of the tree falls suggests that we just don't know, it didn't hold in the oceans?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not the tree falls that are doing it because tropical
the
reefs, for example, are extremely high diversity habitats and there's no analog. And so anyway, there's a lot wrong with that literature. But, intermediate disturbance.
Welcome to the literature.
Welcome to the literature. Intermediate disturbance was one of those things. It's not like that's a wrong hypothesis.
Right.
That's a right hypothesis that just doesn't apply. It doesn't explain what they're claiming.
No, and in fact, that world-class ecologist who you mentioned, who was the person who kind of sent you down this path, was John Vandermeer. And he also was the one who introduced us to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And he had worked in coastal Nicaragua after, I don't remember what hurricane or even exactly what year, but he had happened to have had work pre-hurricane, and then it just got battered. And so he was able to, watch the recovery rates of this forest for many years. Effectively happened to have, been doing work in the right place to study regeneration and such. And I think if memory serves, he sort of wanted to be a fan of the hypothesis, but couldn't quite find a ton of support even in his data set. I think is what.
Yeah, I don't actually remember what he found, but John was always, I thought, excellent at seeing the partial truth in things that were partially true without embracing it or rejecting it.
Totally, no, absolutely. I don't know who this is, but I'll ask the question. Would you be interested in a conversation with Neil Oliver? Thank you and congratulations on your book. Do you know who that is?
Name is not ringing a bell.
Yeah. Can't answer that until and unless we know who that is. Shouldn't we decolonize Western medicines by using medicines discovered by a non-Western person of color and not a tool created by a white European colonizer?
In fact, that's all we should do.
It's the only thing we should do.
I think we should just do that and see if it solves all of our problems. Yes, obviously that is a facetious question.
Yeah.
We should use whatever works, and it doesn't matter where it came from. In fact, we have plenty of ideas that are central to our thinking that were generated, I know this is going to shock some people, but by people who weren't perfect. Sometimes people who were desperately imperfect, like statistics. Do you like statistics? Statistics are great. They allow you to know what the hell's going on. However, they were invented by an anti-Semite.
R.A. Fisher.
Yeah, R.A. Fisher. So anyway,
Total tool.
partial tool.
I mean, and he made great contributions in evolutionary theory too, sex ratio theory. Fantastically important mind in that has contributed to our understanding of the world, and a tool.
You know what I don't like of
his toolness?
The anti-Semitism and the toolness. Those are both things I've never felt positive about. But for example, sex ratio theory, very useful stuff.
Very useful.
Yeah.
Stood the test of time.
Sure has, for good reason.
Unlike some of his unfavorable personality traits and beliefs. A woman with the line, "I spread like syphilis," in her song is going to war for First Amendment rights. How is it we're here?
How is it we're here, indeed?
This is Nicky Minaj. I'm probably mispronouncing her name.
No, I think you've pronounced it perfectly.
Yeah. I've seen, wow. How is it we're here? At some level, she's uncancelable, and this is what this is a point we didn't get to in talking about Michael Shermer, right? Like,
yes.
So let's do that a little bit.
We should have. Very unfortunate that Michael Shermer is now being fused with Nicki Minaj.
Sorry, Michael.
Very sorry about that. We also have defects of personality and apparently timing, and here we are. I don't know. I mean, the fact is,
everyone should aspire to being uncancelable, and many people don't have the way or the means. But it affords you an ability to have a microphone and not have it stolen from you.
Yes,
right?
And maybe it provides some cover. But look, right. I think we need to note what moment we're in. Right, the fact that Nicki Minaj is somehow involved in one of the most serious discussions.
It's been invited to the White House. Apparently, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Obviously, this is not how things are supposed to work, and obviously, it's not functional, right?
Right.
Right, and it's Nicki Minaj reporting an anecdote.
Right.
Right. So,
which means if the anecdote turns out to be in any way untrue, then that will be taken as evidence by the mainstream media that everything that could possibly have been downstream of the anecdote, if it were true, cannot be true either.
But I think
which is a failure of statistical thinking, which again was largely invented by a truly horrible human being who had a great mind.
See earlier point.
That's
right. I think the point that you were making is the right one, which is you have a world full of people. They have a range of expertise on the topics of the moment, and they have a range of cancelability.
Right.
And the people with the expertise are not finding themselves uncancelable, which has silenced many and has caused others to speak up and be canceled.
Right.
And that has left Nicki Minaj as one of the most expert people who is fully not cancelable left, and therefore...
And fully in possession of an anecdote that may or may not be true.
Right.
Whether or not, if it were true, it would suggest something real about underlying patterns.
I guess the point is,
I know nothing about this person, but I doubt that she has a firm grasp on the difference between anecdote and data and what it might mean.
I don't know. I know I don't like what she does for a living, but I don't care. The point is, what's really.
But I mean, in terms of like as a spokesperson,
but
the person being brought to the White House.
But that isn't the point. The point is, you have, by allowing mobs to rule who gets to speak, what they get to say, what platforms they're allowed to speak on, you're left with Nicki Minaj in charge of public health policy, right? And that's not what you want, right? Or in charge of the heterodox view on public health policy,
God.
Right? What you want are people who actually know something about this and have the tools. And I don't think Nicki Minaj is claiming to.
No.
I think she just ends up as somebody who's...
Yeah, she's like, actually, no, I'm not going to shut up. Thank you. No.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, not sure what else to say about it. This is not again, I'm perfectly happy on a normal day to attack Nicki Minaj based on the product she puts into the universe. And
no, you don't attack people.
I don't attack people, but I would attack the product. I don't think it's a positive contribution.
Absolutely.
But, that's neither here nor there. She's hardly distinguished in putting things into the world that aren't positive contributions.
Right.
But the fact is, It is her uncancelableness that has put her central to this controversy, and that says something about the sickness of the environment.
She's used perverse incentives and unregulated market forces to get to the top in a field that is distinguished only for its sort of reprehensibility, and that has given her uncancelability. And now she's saying, actually, no, I saw a thing, and I'm not going to shut up about it. And more of us need the freedom to say, actually, no, I'm not going to shut up about it.
Yep.
Hi, Heather and Bret. Thoughts on the FDA panel rejecting boosters for mainstream population 14 to 65 without health conditions on Friday? By the way, I'm on chapter 5.
Yeah. It's a fascinating development. Fascinating development after 2 high-profile resignations by people who then went on to be authors on a paper in The Lancet. And I don't
What
think...
did the Lancet paper show? I haven't seen the Lancet paper. See if I can pull it.
See if you can...
But I'm going to need more than just...
Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to help you with that. In fact, I don't even have their names at top of mind. But what I would say is I don't think we know what any of this means. Obviously, this is not on script. You have
so
the
is
White
it going to
House
be Marian Gruber and Phil Krause?
I am uncertain.
Okay, so I'm finding those names in the New York Post of all places, telling Politico, et cetera, and then if I take those names to Google Scholar and look up Lancet, you think it's Lancet?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you think it's the Lancet.
You can keep
but anyway, we are somewhere new. This is, high-profile resignations in advance of a high-profile letter critical of the idea that boosters would be useful. Obviously, makes a lot of sense to criticize the possibility of boosters, right? We have vaccines that their immunity is waning over time. That's disappointing. And the degree of protection is failing as a result of the evolution of variants that escape immunity. Boosters at best only correct for the first of those things. So anyway, the policy isn't well thought out, and it is, I think, excellent that people highly placed in the public health system are beginning to speak up.
Indeed. I'm not finding that. I find one of those authors on a Lancet paper, but that's from last year. I don't find either of them in a Lancet paper this year.
Oh, well.
I have to find... There we go. Can you discuss the U.S. and Canadian stance of pasteurized milk, the FDA insistence versus the EU stance, risks, benefits, and juxtapose this with the current pandemic? It's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I don't see the last one right away, but we actually cover a closely related topic in the book, right? We talk about the fact that milk is actually one of the few things in the universe that is supposed to be eaten, right? It is designed as a food, right? Fruits being another, nectar being a third, but it's not, most critters don't want to be eaten. And anyway, the point is, though, milk is supposed to be eaten directly from the breast. And because of that, it is not built to be stable. And so the process of stabilizing, there are lots of ancient ways to stabilize dairy products. You can stabilize them for a short period of time as something like yogurt. You can stabilize them for a much longer period of time as something like cheese. And cuisine, much of cuisine actually is the result of behaviors that we engage in to stabilize unstable foods or to purify foods that might be somewhat compromised, cooking
or
them.
Sometimes to bring together ingredients that together make a complete protein, for instance.
Complete protein, to liberate more nutrition from the same food. In any case, the point is pasteurization is a second level solution to a problem like this. If you're going to take milk and try to transport it as milk over a long distance, there's only so refrigerated it can be.
Yeah, you could transport cheese, but you can't transport milk unless you pasteurize.
Pasteurize it, right. So pasteurize it is derived from Louis Pasteur, who demonstrated that basically life comes from life and doesn't spontaneously regenerate. And that's why if you heat milk to a temperature where all of the things that might be living in it die off and you keep it hermetically sealed, then it stays stable. So anyway, it's a solution to a problem. Does it cause other problems? Undoubtedly it does.
There's also, and I do not, I would have to look into this to know exactly where the boundaries between these issues are, but most milk in the US is both pasteurized and homogenized as well. And I don't think that those need to go hand in hand. And the homogenization process, I don't know what it's adding.
Oh.
And maybe if all it is adding is basically uniformity of product, and you don't have to shake, right?
Right.
In order to get it back into solution, I think there is some evidence suggesting that homogenization does have negative effects in terms of, for instance, just all of the fat globules that you're drinking are the same size now as opposed to different sizes, and thus triggering different things in your system. Assuming that you're that you have lactase persistence, that you have the enzyme that can digest milk sugars. That a sort of an intermediate stage could be to pasteurize but not homogenize milk. As well, which again would, it's like asking people to select produce that might not be quite as pretty, but might actually have more of the original nutrients because it was grown in, dirt versus hydroponically or something.
Right. I think, though, this actually makes a pretty good test landscape for the model in our book because, we've talked on DarkHorse about the supply chain length for food having negative consequences on things like nutrition. We talk in the book about technologies, ancient technologies for preserving things like milk, like turning them into cheese. We now have newfangled ways of doing certain things like pasteurization and homogenization. Those things have consequences. Those consequences emerge late. There's a question about whether or not the right thing to do is ignore those consequences because they're small. Let those consequences alter what you're eating. Like maybe if your supply chain is so long that milk can't make it that distance, maybe you'd be better off with cheese or something like that. And so anyway, we're not going to tell you the answer to those questions, but the point is that's how you'd set up the problem.
Yeah.
Right?
No, exactly. And I mean, it's also of course true that in the US you can often find small farms that will sell you unpasteurized milk, but that de facto the supply chain is very short there.
De facto the supply chain is very short, and there's the perverse incentive surrounding the litigious instinct and the danger of disease.
It's a danger to the farmer for sure to sell such product.
Right, and you can't imagine a distribution network, to the extent that the occasional person might get sick from unpasteurized milk, right? You expect the system to solve the problem by potentially making milk less valuable and possibly even harmful because the diseases you might get from milk that has been degraded in this way are not going to be something you can pin on an individual farm or distributor at all, right? Whereas if you get E. coli, dangerous E. coli infection from a particular batch of milk, that does trace back to somebody. So this is a place where our system is not biased against harm. It's not obsessed with your safety. What it is obsessed with not being able to prove that the harm came from a particular place. And it's a bad bias.
Boy, and I mean, those are inextricably linked. I think... Interesting. While you were talking, I came to a slightly different conclusion, which will sound like it is contradictory. I don't think it is. I think both things are true. What you said is, it's not that it's not that the system is concerned with the harm, but concerned with being able to point to what it is that harmed you.
Yeah.
Whereas I was thinking, actually, and this has sort of been percolating as we've been having a lot of these conversations about the book these last few weeks, that even more generally than I think we have thought through before, the safetyism, the safety culture of childhood and parenting and schools now is actually true culture-wide. And that we have a society-wide, and this is what the Litigious Society hands us as well, society-wide, we have like a safetyism meter, and it's turned all the way to 11. This one goes to 11 across every domain, everywhere. And it is, at what cost? in some places health, in some places experience, in some cases serendipity, risk, all of the things that one learns from actually not having a single factor turned up so high that everything else falls off.
Yeah, but I'm not disagreeing with you, and in fact, we wrote this into the book too. But it's not even safetyism, right? It's like safety of a particular kind, and the consequence of turning that dial to 11 is to make you desperately unsafe in some other way, right?
Well, but no, I mean, I think that is safetyism. I think that's, that is the cruel irony of the term, that it is people who are speaking as if, and I believe almost entirely, if not entirely, in the case of like what's happening to children, really think they're making children safer. Yeah. Right. But the effect is precisely the opposite. That doesn't make it not safetyism. That is what it is. That is what it's called. But it's not actually increasing safety.
Right. I agree. But somehow I don't think the world gets this, which is it finds us obsessed with keeping you safe, and it does not understand that we are obsessed with keeping you safe in this domain, and we manifestly don't give a shit in other domains. Right. Yeah. Your short-term safety, we're obsessed with it, right? Because the litigious society focuses on these very directly accessible causes.
That's right.
And we, policy kills people in large numbers by being indifferent to harms that are hard to prove.
No, and we do say this precisely in the book, and I actually can't, it could be so many places, I can't remember exactly where it ended up, but the idea, a teenager dies on a school trip, and it's a tragedy, and it is also a story that is relatively easy to tell, and it pulls at the heartstrings, and everyone associated with that trip will remember it forever, and they will be called back to it by on the anniversaries and such. And such tragedies can be avoided by moving towards an almost absolute safetyism. But the kind of safetyism that then pervades things like schools who have perhaps had a tragedy and have then decided to move the slider all the way to the other side is a greater tragedy. And there may not be deaths that you can point to as a result, but there will be a society-wide lack of potential, of capacity, of realized humanity, because people are unskilled and too scared to move and too scared to act.
It is even the case that if we just compare trips to trips, right? If you decide not to have trips because of the danger of what might happen on a trip, it is impossible to measure how many lives will be lost because people didn't go on the kinds of trips in which they might have learned something about how to manage risk.
Right.
And this is it's an error. It is a tragedy that our system is biased in favor of what it can see, and excellent at ignoring that which it could infer but cannot see.
Yes.
And
Yes. All right. That was our answer to pasteurized milk.
Yes, of course. Right.
Yes. I don't know what this means, but it's fascinating, so we'll go with it. With quantum effects found in the retinas of night migratory robins, can we reasonably postulate further? Could quantum spins explain a mother's sense of a child's pain at a distance? I don't know what quantum effects found in retinas of night migratory robins means. I haven't seen the finding in question.
I don't think it matters to the question, really. If we just assume that such things are plausible and there. I'm not saying they are, but if you proceed from that premise, I would say pretty unlikely, because you have much better mechanisms for such things. But
it's almost, could quantum spins explain a mother's sense of a child's pain at distance is almost, what is the crazy hypothesis that consciousness predates matter? What's that called?
Panpsychism.
It's almost a panpsychic. It almost circles back on panpsychism.
Right, which may be a perfectly viable myth in order to proceed through life without being a mechanistic description of anything. And all I would say is, you need to be a little more creative in thinking about how it is that, for example, a mother might detect distress of a child at a distance. And there are lots of mechanisms, including, cycles that the mother may not be aware of in conscious terms that get disturbed by distress, that when those cycles, like when a room is too quiet and a mother has a sense of, oh, wait a second, is there something afoot somewhere else in the house? I haven't heard from the kids in longer than it would normally be. Therefore, there may be something going on that I need to check in on. And 3 times out of 4, there isn't anything. But 1 time out of 4, she catches the
washing machine is on fire.
As they sometimes are. Right. So anyway, I guess my point is there are lots of ways that don't require us to hypothesize any force we don't know about that begin to explain, and this happens with all sorts of people. You know, somebody has a habit of calling you at some interval and they don't call you, and you begin to, some part of you is monitoring the fact that something doesn't feel right over in that space.
Or then they do call, but it's a little bit later, and you say, I was just thinking of you. Isn't that amazing? Well,
right, exactly, right. Or something in the timbre of somebody's voice or whatever. So anyway, I think the point is you don't need quantum effects to explain what you're talking about.
Still, I'd like to know about the retinas of the night migratory robins.
Well, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would. What's your opinion on going to tanning salons in the winter to boost vitamin D?
I have actually been thinking about this very question.
Have you?
Yeah, I totally have, which is that given the role vitamin D seems to play in terms of preserving health, or maybe the way to say it is that vitamin D deficiency plays in making one vulnerable to communicable diseases in the winter, that there is an argument for I don't know if it's tanning beds or rooms or whatever that would create vitamin D and make people healthier. But it's a pretty good reason to do that. So,
yeah, I don't know. I've never looked into tanning beds. I don't know the sort of UVA, UVB, UVC ratios and
right.
What.
So what? But you and I, of course, land in the same place then, which is. There ought to be tanning beds that are tuned to minimize the risk and maximize the vitamin D creation benefit.
But the chances that they're likely to be the ones that exist for people to get winter tans indoors seems small to me.
Right. On the other hand, if people understood the connection between vitamin D deficiency and ill health, then
the market might create such things.
Sure it would. For one thing, it's got to be, I don't want to say it has to be, but it's probably pretty close to trivial to add a setting that would allow you to dial in the nature of the tanning device so that it gave you the optimal thing for whatever you were trying to accomplish.
Well, I guess one other thing that I don't know that's relevant to this question is whether or not the vitamin D that would be generated from being exposed to artificial sun, how comparable are these 3 things? The vitamin D generated by exposure to the actual sun, the vitamin D generated by exposure to an artificial sun, and the vitamin D encountered by taking a supplement. Yep. And it's those last 2 categories that, that are maybe what you would be constrained to in the winter. And in general, as we write in the book, and as you know of me, I'm not a fan of supplements. I would rather get my stuff from my food and my activities and engaging as humans have typically engaged with the world. But vitamin D seems like a supplement, as far as we can tell, is quite effective.
Yep.
Quite effective, quite low risk. And so, if that is true, why not just take the supplement?
Why not just take the supplement? Well, I think we have an analogous question with respect to something like coffee.
Okay.
That basically, because you've got a complex system that has detectors on it, or in the case of vitamin D, it has synthesizers in the skin, that there's really just a question of, do you want to get that update by plugging in an Ethernet cable, or do you want to get that update over the Wi-Fi? And the coffee can wake you up in the morning, and you take it in through your gut. And the same thing would happen if you stared into cool spectrum light as soon as you got up, right? Is there a reason to prefer one of these? I'm sure there's a spectrum of reasons, but it's not obvious to me that the priority should go to the through the gut route rather than the over the air route.
Well, and this is, I think, then I think you're agreeing with me in this particular case then, that to my surprise, I find evidence that vitamin D supplementation is actually effective and not particularly costly and super easy compared to, I'm going to have to go spend an hour a week or whatever it might be in a tanning bed. Like, why wouldn't you, if there is similar efficacy, if, as it seems, vitamin D supplementation is actually effective and taking it in the way that our ancestors have, generating vitamin D the way that our ancestors have generated it, doesn't have as many different effects as many other things do, then, I would always prefer to be generating my vitamin D out in the sun.
Yep.
But then if I'm restricted from that because of the season, and it's a tanning bed that's been tuned just right, which may or may not exist in the world yet, versus a pill.
Right.
In this case, I'd prefer the pill, actually.
Yeah, I agree. On the other hand, you could imagine, a tanning bed that was tuned so it did little harm, gave you some tan, and created vitamin D. That would be an attractive option to people.
You're saying I look pale.
I'm not saying anything like that, darling. I'm just saying it's not obvious to me that the pill is the one to bet on for being to having the fewest arbitrary consequences. But I'd be interested to know.
Conservatively, it would be the opposite. The assumption would be the opposite, I would think. So, okay. Next question. What are we at? We're at 45 minutes? 50 minutes. Just finished the book and I love it. I wish I could have been your student and learned to free myself from fears of being outside. A yellow jacket sting behind my knee when I was 4 and another on top of my foot when I was 9 caused fear that I unfortunately allowed to control me. Anyway, the solutions you propose at the end of the book align so well with Peter Joseph's. I'm surprised he hasn't been a guest yet. I believe he's a dark horse and will be integral in building the bridge to a sane future.
Interesting.
You know this name?
I don't.
I don't know this name either.
All right. Well, we should look into him.
Peter Joseph. If the mod is there, if you would take a note and send that to us so that we don't lose track, since I don't end up looking back at these questions with our new system and reminding myself of past questions. It's going to be another person that at least I am not familiar with. In this case, I think our excuse is that apparently he was working in the 1940s. Are you familiar with Dr. Raymond Rife, who, in the 1940s, treated all manner of disease with light and sound? His work was first lauded, then squashed for not being profitable. Would love to see it revived and improved upon. It sounds fascinating. You've not heard of this guy.
No, but it sounds like he had a sound method. Oh. I don't know. You shed some light on the problem. Something. All right. It's getting late is what's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it is.
Yep.
It is. No, that looks, and actually if the mod would also, so that name as well, Dr. Raymond Rife, would love to look into that. The idea, yeah. It's like the doctors who were treating tuberculosis by taking patients outside. And then once we had antibiotics, which are amazing and life-saving, instead of enhancing the existing treatments, they were replacing them. And so now we had enclosed wards with no airflow and the treatment of patients entirely with antibiotics. And some people got sicker because airflow is actually a tremendous healer. And the idea of light and sound, I don't know what the particulars are here, but it sounds intriguing.
Yep.
I found that I have aphantasia. I'm actually not sure if that's aphantasia or aphantasia. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I found I have aphantasia. Sounds better. The inability to picture things in your mind's eye. Do you have any thoughts on this condition, evolutionary or otherwise?
Well, so
inability to picture things in your mind's eye. I've heard of this before, and I always lose the concept afterwards.
I wonder about it though, because
I do too.
The fact is, I don't have this condition at all, but when I try to picture things in my mind, it's not like looking at them, right? Mm-hmm. It's a partial thing. And I'm even pretty good at this. I can take a complex object and rotate it do things like that. Sometimes I can
Dude.
build a mechanism and kind of run it and see if it would actually work, in my opinion, or not.
Oh, like what kind of mechanism? Because that first one is just like the classic, men are better at this than women are.
Right.
Like, 3D movement of 3D objects in space.
Yeah. No, if I wanted to, if we were in the field and I needed to build something to solve some problem, right? A pulley-driven system or whatever, right? And I didn't have the materials that I wanted, for example. I could sort of think through what it would look like, and I could run the twine through the pulleys and get a sense for how much tension there would be and whether I think they're likely to break.
And you might be, you actually might be less likely than I would, for instance, to want to draw it out.
Yeah, I've done that. It's not that effective. I'm better at conjuring it. But my point is, when I do that, which I'm able to
draw it out on a piece of paper, I mean.
Right. If I conjure it in my mind and I try to look at it, I don't see a picture of it exactly. It's not held that way. So I guess what I'm saying is...
That's interesting. Whereas I totally do. Like you were like, pulley system. I'm like, okay, there we go. Got it.
All right.
And you're going to start including things like, got to change that. Oh, that one's bigger. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So when I do that, it looks more like the way things are in dreams, which I described in one of the recent weeks' podcasts as only partially rendered. Right?
Yeah, you did. And I think that this is going to be a place where some brains are very different. I think I end up with stills from dreams that seem totally rendered to the edges of consciousness. But they're like hyper rendered. Some, I don't know my art history well enough to identify the types of art, but some art from some periods in history is just so elaborate, like Rococo, and just ridiculous levels of detail, or posters of the rainforest. Like, this is the rainforest. It's got a jaguar and a monkey and a porcupine. Like, it's so everything right there.
It's not surreal. It's not hyper real. It's get real. Because the rainforest doesn't look like that.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But you're saying that it's more like it's like an XKCD comic.
It is like that XKCD comic. It's also the case, like if I try to conjure a face of somebody that I know really well, like yours, for example, hard to do in the abstract, right? It's hard to do it from memory. So anyway, I guess the point is you do want to know what normal looks like, or given your hypothesis, what the range of normal looks like before you figure out what the condition you have and how different it is from, because you may be expecting something that's just not simply what everybody experiences.
And okay, I mean, this is the thing that actually gets us canceled, but
oh God.
You and I have conversations like this, like we've never had that particular conversation before, but which reveal how very different our brains are. And frankly, the shorthand that we use to describe this particular difference, long before we ever ran into the psychological description that many psychologists think is ridiculous and should never be uttered aloud, was that you are much more auditory and I am much more visual. That was the language that we used. And then we would see in our students, again, long before we ran into this, so like visual, auditory, kinesthetic, learning styles, stuff that, some psychologists think is accurate, and some say if you think that, you're a moron and you've just proved that you don't know what you're doing. I know that my brain is very different from yours, and some of it is exactly in this area where, when you say, well, dreams aren't fully rendered, I'm like, well, I think mine are. Right? Or, when I see things in my head, but I don't really, I don't see them as visuals. I'm like, oh, I do. And, this accounts for, I have it much less now, but I used to be able to just say things backwards, right? Because I see the words in my head as I not so much now because I'm doing so much talking all the time, but used to be whenever I was thinking about a word, it's because I saw it. And so it was perfectly easy to read it backwards as forwards. And to you, in this way, I would say, you're a normie. Like, you're like, what is that? Like, why would you how can you do that? And how is it that the words are showing up for you? So I don't quite understand why so many psychologists seem eager to dismiss this kind of difference as, pop psych, clearly bunk, when many of the same people are willing to talk about neurodiversity.
Well, I have to say I both resonate with it, right? When I read something, I hear it. Right.
And I certainly don't.
Right.
Yeah.
So I know that that's real.
Yeah.
I don't think of myself as auditory and not visual. Right. I don't think that's how it works. Is there a priority for the auditory? Probably.
Right.
But anyway, I guess the point is until you describe it correctly, you would expect people to reject it. They falsify it too easily because the proper response is something like, there's an important piece of truth there, but it's not true.
But I just have not seen that. I haven't seen that pushback.
Yeah.
It's always, this is nonsense. Really? Have you met people? Have you talked deeply to people about how it is that they form ideas and plan to make things or plan actions?
Yeah.
Like the differences, I imagine that we could discover similar differences and similarities in, for instance, how we wayfind and how we imagine, navigating in the world. And there's clearly distinctions to be unearthed and discovered.
Yeah. You sometimes find it very disturbing if I'm driving and I take a way that is less efficient, even if it's only very slightly less efficient, and I may have chosen it for some other reason. You're like immediately like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I also cannot stand having the voice give directions. It throws me. It makes me a less good. Like I cannot tolerate it. And I think just having the voice come like, no way, no how, ever.
Well, I hate it too, but I don't hate it more than missing my exit because it was on the screen and I happened to be thinking about something else and not looking at the screen. And
Anyway, to be continued, I expect.
Yeah.
Any young adult book recommendations on natural selection and evolution? Bookstore science sections are lacking. I have a 16-year-old niece, advanced reader. Majority of adults don't grasp evolution. Man, all of that is true. And the last time, it was pre-COVID, but I spent a long time in the YA, the young adult section of Powell's, which is the city of books here in Portland. It's extraordinary, an amazing bookstore, and was so disappointed by the offerings across the board. I wasn't even looking for science. That said, science fiction might be a place where you can find some stuff. On the other hand, very little science fiction actually gets the biology right.
Yep. It depends how young is the problem. If you're not that young,
16-year-old niece,
16.
Advanced reader.
Oh, then, that's...
What are you thinking?
I'm thinking Blind Watchmaker. I'm thinking River Out of Eden, which I have not read, but is obviously targeted to be readily comprehensible.
Mm-hmm. So these are both Dawkins books.
Yeah.
I guess YA as a genre tends to be fiction.
Yeah.
And so I read that as looking for fiction. But if you're willing to go nonfiction, I haven't read River Out of Eden. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I haven't read it. But he's a good writer and a clear communicator and a good thinker, and that could work.
And I would say Selfish Gene later. It's not the place to start. It can be if you're a college student, it's probably the place to start. But if you're just learning to think this way, it's not the one to start with.
Let's try to do two more here. Does evolution decide what traits to remove? If an organism reproduces successfully, wouldn't that mean every trait would be passed on?
Great question. Yeah, it does decide what to move, and it does it in more or less the same way that it decides how to add something. In fact, it's easier to remove things because they can go latent, right? So you can have... I was just thinking about this for some other reason, which I can't remember, but you can have something called a loss of function mutation, where you imagine it takes up a lot of selection in order to get all of the amino acids in the resulting protein to be correct for it to fold into the shape that does a job, but it doesn't take very many changes to cause it not to be functional. And so anyway, there are loss of function mutations. You can take a gene dormant or latent and then reactivate it later. And so those are in fact easier processes than building something up de novo. And they happen the same way, which is that there's variation in what is expressed, what is in the phenotype. And when a variation is a savings, it provides a competitive advantage to individuals who have that savings. I will say that in the realm, again, this leans heavily towards what we talk about in the book, but when a trait is transmitted outside of the genome, as many human traits, including many of the most important human traits are, this is a trivial process, right? So if you think about religions as compendiums of wisdom that alters behavior in ways that are adaptive, you have sectarian difference in what parts of a sacred text to pay attention to and which parts to de-emphasize. And those individuals that subscribe to a version of their belief that is correct, that is efficient about which things not to pay attention to and which things to retain, and they have an advantage because the behavior is altered in a way that ideally splits the difference. Their view of the book and which things matter will come to dominate. And those who have some other view where they retain things that are pointless will have a disadvantage, and their view will disappear. And maybe those who have the view that is waning because it's inefficient will adopt the view that has become dominant because it feels like the right thing to do. But anyway, the point is, selection sorts things that are not genetically transmitted even more easily than it does things that are transmitted in the genome.
Very good. Good. Final question. Yes or no? People find it much harder to forgive someone for being right than for being wrong. I think this is true.
I also think that this is true. I don't think it's going to be universal.
Sure.
It probably has to do with the topic and the person.
Well, and how sure you were that you thought they were wrong.
Yeah.
And what you think the stakes are, and how long it lasted, and all of these other factors, of course. But if you control for all of them, I think yes.
Yeah, I do too.
In part because if a person is wrong, and it's become clear that they're wrong and they wronged you, they owe you an apology. So they come to you and they give you an apology. But if a person is right, they don't owe you an apology.
Yeah.
And so you don't get, in fact, you may be the person who owes an apology.
Yep.
And if you are dealing with having been wrong yourself by being self-deluded, or by having cognitive dissonance, which I guess is a form of self-delusion, and therefore cannot acknowledge that you were wrong in a way that actually might warrant an apology, but some little part of you may recognize it, that there is an apology warranted, and it's nothing that can come from the other side. That is going to be a harder thing to forgive, even though it's not forgiveness. That the person who isn't forgiving is not in a position that they should be demanding it.
I agree.
Yeah. Very insightful question. I think that has taken us to the end of this week.
Wow.
Unless you want to pose a question.
No. God, no.
God, no. You didn't want to pose a question now.
The sooner we stop dealing with questions this week, the better.
Really?
I don't know.
I don't think you mean that.
No, I don't really mean that.
You know what tomorrow is?
I do. It's Sunday.
Our producer is snort laughing in the background because you just walked into a little mess that you made of yourself, didn't you?
Well, I thought I knew what day it was, and I'm right. And you're having trouble forgiving me for it. Is that what's going on?
Yes, it is. I forgive you for being right in a very, very limited way. What I was going to say.
You know fall is coming, and you're going to need me during the fall. You'll see.
Tomorrow is a day on which neither of us need to be on screen at all.
What?
I know.
No screen anywhere?
No screen.
Amazing.
And I think that is a wonderment. We really do enjoy doing these, and so appreciate the audience and are so grateful for you guys. But we have also been spending way too much time.
Way too much time
right here,
staring into cameras. But just because we will not be looking into cameras. Does not mean we will not be appearing on a screen near you.
I'm sure it will be, yes.
Congratulations or our apologies, depending upon how you view that. But in any case, yeah, tomorrow we will not be looking into cameras. That's cool.
Tomorrow we will not be looking into cameras. Again, I will just end by suggesting that you share this video if you liked it, and that you subscribe to the channels, and that if you find a way to get a copy of the book. If you're here this long, you're probably interested, and so buy it or borrow it from a library, from a friend, and read it. And after you do, if you would leave a review, that would be wonderful. Anything to say before I sign us out?
I don't think so.
All right. Be good to the ones you love, eat good food, and get outside.
Be well, everyone.